So I said last week that I wanted to read this article from John Hopkins with a particular expert in the field of addiction that's been researching it for a very long time. That said the way that we're treating addiction is questionable and it needs to be examined a little bit more in depth and detail. Now, of course, your AA people would jump in at this point and say, "Well, it's just one article, it's just one person's opinion, and the big book has been saving people millions of lives and all that other claptrap blabber that they do." And while one article by no means can totally debunk the entire religious nonsense that is AA or end the way that we're treating addiction here in this country, it is just really good for me to see an article like this, because I can tell you when I got court ordered, well, not court ordered, I didn't get court ordered until I'd been in AA 5 years. When I got exposed to AA almost 20 years ago now, it's hard to believe that much time has gone by, but you did not see anything critical of the 12-step model too much. You might could find an article once in a while that would say something a little bit derogatory about the 12 steps, but ultimately it would fall back on the same old lines that we've heard a million times before. It would say something like, although there are downsides to the program, it still saved millions of people, or like George Valiant, that researched the program for years and found out that it made drinking and binges and relapses way more deadly and way more serious. Came back and said it was still a good program because it brought people to God. Really skewered thinking there. But you would not have ever seen an article like this coming out from somebody that's a professional in the field that was willing to talk about these things, and you wouldn't have seen it published. Believe it or not, the very first time I ever saw anything that didn't put AA in a holy light was the Armitage Papers, the online Armitage Papers. There was a couple of books I remember at the time. I didn't get a chance to read them. There was AA Cult or Cure, and a few things like that. There was a website called Positive Atheism that actually did a few exposés about it, but these were considered kind of fringe. It wasn't considered really mainstream. You would have never seen a medical journal publishing an article like this. I had some things highlighted for this article, but something kind of went on the blitz with this computer, and I kind of lost my highlights when I had to reboot it. There's what is that thing I saw in one of the entertainment sections on the news today? We're in the middle of something called Mercury retrograde, and apparently during Mercury retrograde, phones don't work, computers don't work, communication is off base, and everything is haywire. In fact, we've been in it for a few weeks now, so maybe that's really what's wrong with the world right now. With the Ukraine-Russia situation, with the railroads workers that almost went on strike, and all the other numerous things to have anxiety about. Maybe it's just Mercury retrograde and it'll all pass on October the 2nd when it. But anyway, I do know that my computer's been acting weird today, but whether that's the planets or whether that's just my computer, I'll leave that up to you to decide. But I'm going to jump right into this article here where it says, Addiction and Recovery, a Philosopher's View. Philosophy professor Hannah Pickard suggests that no case of addiction is exactly like another, and understanding why someone chooses to continue using drugs despite the personal cost is vital to their recovery. And the article was written by a journalist named Katie Pierce. It was published on September the 16th. It says, it's time for America to end its black and white thinking about addiction and recovery. Big thumbs up for me on that one. According to John Hopkins professor Hannah Pickard, traditional approaches in the U.S. framing addiction as a moral failing or a disease of the brain do not suffice. Is addiction a brain disease? Cards on the table, I don't know, she admits. Well, I'd have to ask her a question if I was sitting across from her, which will never happen, of course, but I'd have to say to her, for someone who says they don't know if it's a disease or not, I would pose this question like this. You don't know if it's a brain disease or not, I get that, but in terms of the way the cult religion defines a brain disease, which is not a brain disease, but a soul sickness, a spiritual malady, a physical, mental, and biological type thing that only a spiritual experience can cure, that it's caused by 100 forms of fear, resentment, selfishness, and self-centeredness, turning your back on God, being blocked from the sunlight of the spirit, and not doing a fourth step. I bet she would disagree with me on that. I bet she would disagree with that idea that it's a disease. It's a disease that will punish you with drunkenness from an AA god unless you do a fifth step. I'm sure she wouldn't adhere to that one at all. But I get what she's driving at there. It's just, it irritates me how AA hijacks the word disease, and a lot of the times, like right there in that article where she said, is it a disease? I don't know. The AA people would puff up and say, see, that proves it right there. It could be a disease. You know, they grasp at straws for everything. What she's calling a disease, what the scientific community may call a brain disease, and what AA calls a disease is two different diseases altogether. Okay, that would be no different than the people who thought epilepsy at one time was demonic possession. Okay, that's how far apart the scientific terminology is here. But anyway, regardless, she suggests the danger of reducing addiction to only an explanation of a disease obscures other important factors, such as the psychological function and significance of drugs for those who struggle with addiction, or the social and economic context of their drug use, and can also sometimes create a sense of helplessness and pessimism in patients themselves. Pretty sure that pessimism and helplessness comes from people that were in my situation and the situation of so many others who, when you tried to find help for your addiction, you were given a phony cult religion in order to pull you out of it. I mean, that's where the pessimism and hopelessness comes from in a lot of cases. But again, I get what she's driving at here. If you're in a socioeconomic condition where you can't get out of it, and the world looks pretty horrible, then yeah, you know, it was kind of like an article I read one time about a particular, it was a particular farmer in Eastern Europe that had gotten an injury, and due to the government regulations, there was no kind of compensation for what he did, and it said he defiantly told the person interviewing him, yeah, I've been drinking way more vodka and smoking way more cigarettes ever since this injury. It was almost like, you know, fuck you. I mean, I've got nothing to live for anyway kind of feeling. So I get where she's driving at there, but I just wanted to point that out. Instead, Pickard, who has spent over a decade examining literature on addiction across a wide range of disciplines, a wide variety, I almost said, but the word was range, tends to look for trends and provide analysis, espouses the term heterogeneity. I think I'm saying that correctly. Heterogeneity. It means diversity. You could say the heterogeneity of the human species, you know, the many different races, the character aspects, etc., you know, like that. That's what it means, but I don't know if I'm saying it correctly or not. And it says one virtue of her theoretical approach is that it better aligns with the conventions of good clinical care, which would specifically be tailored to each individual and their needs, respecting their own stances towards drug use and hopes for the future. There is never one simple or easy answer for why people continue using drugs and alcohol despite negative consequences in their life. You'll find a wide range of reasons that vary with each person, each drug, and each setting. Well, I'd have to agree with her there totally. In a recent conversation preceding National Recovery Month, Pickard spoke with Hub about her latest thoughts on the complexities of defining and treating drug addiction in America. Our basic conceptualizations, she says, haven't been fully productive, and it's time for a change. I can jump on board with that one. And for that reason, it actually feels like an extremely exciting and forward-looking time to be a part of addiction research currently. If she's talking about research that could actually begin to shift the public consciousness away from the 12-step religion, if she's talking about research that could shift the public consciousness away from giving people a license to treat people who are addicted like garbage due to tough love, if she's talking about shifting society away from criminalizing and throwing people in jail for their addictions, then yeah, I would agree. This is an exciting time for her. It should be an exciting time for anyone who struggled with addiction. It may not be an exciting time for the cult religion of Quackaholics Anonymous, because AA might just end up in the history book pages as a really bad cult religion, whereas is exactly where it belongs, I might add. Anyway, a lot of my work has been focused on how addiction is defined. Prior to developing addiction, there's no mystery as to why people use drugs or alcohol. The real or potential costs they bring have tremendous benefits: pleasure, relief from negative experiences like pain, stress, and emotional suffering, or promise of new positive experiences like even social connection or spiritual transformation. And by contrast, addiction is associated with heartbreaking, life-destroying costs, loss of family, friends, jobs, housing, health, and in jurisdictions that criminalize possession, freedom.
These costs seem to outweigh any benefits. The shift in balance creates the puzzle of addiction. Why do people keep doing these things given that the costs outweigh the benefits? I think this puzzle can determine what addiction is and thereby specifies what a good theory or serious understanding of the addiction must do in order to treat the problem. But defining addiction in this way raises a very difficult question. I'm going to skip a couple of lines here, but she says that there is no particular way to agree on an issue or draw a line and say this is where addiction begins or this is where casual use ends and addiction begins. Sometimes there is no issue because everyone, including the person addicted, can agree upon it, but sometimes there is disagreement. When you have people who use drugs or drink, and their families, friends, doctors, wider society, and the state are against them, but they personally do not see that they're causing any harm, and they may not be breaking any legalities, then the answer to the question is who gets to determine what is addiction and who gets to determine when addiction is destructive. And she says that determination must be by the individual themselves. Finally, somebody says it. You know, this made me think about something just then. There were many times I wanted to do a video why AA doesn't believe that addiction is a disease. Why the rehab industry does not believe addiction is a disease. For one thing, look at how they treat relapses. Look at how drug court punishes people. Look at how halfway houses and 12-step rehab centers, how they treat people who are addicted. They treat them like less than human beings. They treat them cruelly. They take pleasure in their death. Some have to die so that others can live kind of thing. They don't believe it's a disease. They don't believe it's a disease at all. They believe it's a choice. They'll even tell you when you relapse in AA, you chose to drink. It's all about selling the religion, the cult religion. It doesn't have anything to do with no fucking disease, and they're not interested in treating the problem either. Anyway, had to throw that out there before I jump back on. It's very complicated for a person to decide this on their own because various psychological issues, lack of insight, cognitive dissonance, or even just kind of a resigned hopelessness can make it hard to know when a person's values are truly being breached by drug use. Defining addiction through the lens of that puzzle and recognizing the role those values must play is a far cry from viewing addiction as a prototypical disease that's defined and diagnosed by underlying brain pathology. It's much more complicated than that. She says, well, AA doesn't believe in brain pathology. AA believes that you've abandoned God and that God is punishing you and causing you to bottom out so you can turn your will and your life over to Him, as they say in the big capital letters in their stupid fucking meetings. But something is very similarly true, though, for people who who are reliant upon pain medication, she notes. There are people, and I'm going to skim some of this because I know what she's talking about. There are people out there in the world today that suffer with everything from spinal degeneration to spinal arthritis to regular bone arthritis to, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and any number of debilitating conditions that require pain medication in order to get by in the world and survive. You can't call all those people addicts because they're taking pain pills in order to deal with the chronic conditions of their lives. Any arrogant, judgmental AA person that would judge somebody for that, I would say wait till it happens to you. But of course, they would say it's okay when they're doing it. It's just not okay when you do it. By the way, that does give me an idea for a video. I don't know how many people have been in those meetings when they're like, yeah, I was in a car crash and my whole entire leg was cut off and my entire shoulder bone was sticking out, and I was slit all the way down here, and the ambulance told me that I needed to take a pain pill, and I said, no, my sobriety is more important than that. That's a bunch of bullshit, but it's a stupid abstinence contest, which means absolutely nothing. But that's another video from another time, so I'll just stick with the article here. So the prevailing models for understanding addiction in the U.S., where do you think they fall short? The interviewer asked her. Historically, in American culture, there's been a somewhat puritanical streak that condemns pleasure-seeking behaviors as morally wrong, even when so many of our behaviors are exactly about seeking pleasure. Finally, someone says it. Finally, someone in the mainstream medical community says it. There is nothing wrong with seeking pleasure. There's nothing wrong with it at all. You know, AA is almost a weird pleasure denial abstinence contest, really. You know, I've even heard people in AA bragging about the last time they actually kissed another girl or something like that. In other words, you're bragging about the fact that you're not By the way, that's usually coming from a 13th stepper. But the fact that that was culturally accepted in an AA meeting rubs me the wrong way. I mean, the idea that everything pleasurable or everything that gives you any kind of amount of pleasure is an inherently evil thing is one of the dumbest things that's at the bedrock of this society. And I think it kind of needs to be done away with. And I'm glad she brought that up. Anyway, got to keep going. People do use drugs for pleasure. People use alcohol for pleasure. Lots of people do, even if that's not the only reason they use them. But this can lead to people being condemned morally for what they do, and the idea that they're a poor character or a poor moral character. In other words, this idea that they are weak individuals who only care about seeking pleasure above all else. I believe this is a harmful attribute that we have given to addiction. Totally agree with her 100%. More recently, there's been a shift, though, from that kind of thinking to a brain disease model. The core thinking is chronic immoderate drug use causes brain pathology and chemical changes to the brain, which itself ultimately controls a person's impulses. Once addicted, the person can't help but use them, and they've lost their freedom of will, whatever that ultimately means, because their brain is damaged, hijacked by the drugs. The continuation of drug use, in effect, becomes a passive symptom of an underlying brain disease, as opposed to the kind of thing we should try to understand and explain from more ordinary psychological, social, and economic perspectives. I understand what she's saying here, but if she has read a wide, diverse range of literature as she's talking about, and I'm inclined to believe her, then surely she would know that this idea that you turned your back on God and that you're blocking yourself from the sunlight of the Spirit by taking a swallow of liquor, it has nothing to do with brain pathology. It's just fucking cult religion. I mean, she's probably in a position where she can't be as blunt and as direct as I guess I'm being on here, but I understand that there's a delicate balance here. Most addiction experts can't come out and say this is a crock of fucking shit. I can do that because I'm free to, but I think she kind of hinted at that with the idea that this is not a moral problem, but brain pathology and AA don't belong in the same sentence together. AA doesn't give a flying fuck about brain pathology. AA just wants cult religion recruits. And anyway, it's incredibly important to combat stigma and condemnation of people suffering from addiction. I'm with her there. In this respect, some motivations behind the brain disease model are excellent in terms of chemistry and pathology and brain damage. If I had to choose between a moral model and the brain disease model, I'd choose the latter without hesitation. When she says brain disease, she's not talking about the 12-step definition of a disease being, willfully defiant to God and all that other horse shit that's in their big book. She's talking about chemical brains. That almost sounds like the name of a band or an album, right? Or a punk song, Chemical Brains. No, she's talking about chemical changes in the brain, chemical things that happen in our minds that could lead us to lose control over our compulsions is what she's talking about. She's not talking about cult religion. But anyway, I would like us to spend more time seriously interrogating the moralistic assumptions that we make about drug use. Why exactly are some drugs characterized as bad? For example, heroin, which is criminalized even if it's used recreationally, while others are not. For example, alcohol, which is legal and widely socially accepted. And why exactly are some purposes for drugs bad, such as for recreational pleasure, while others are not, such as for pain relief? What she hits upon here was something I hadn't really ever thought about before, but it is something that she brings about an important salient point to. If I said in public, in front of a group of upstanding citizens, for lack of a better term, if I said to them, it's been a stressful week. I think I'm going to go to the bar and I'm going to have a drink. Nobody would bat an eyelid or an eyelash or whatever. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm talking too much fast here. But if, on the other hand, I said, it's been a really stressful week. I think I'm going to go and I'm going to snort a little coke and maybe pop a Valium or something like that. Everybody would react in horror. I'm not saying that snorting coke and popping Valium together is a good combination. I mean, you could throw your heart out, but you could do the same thing going to a bar and having a drink. Because we all know when I say I'm going to go to the bar and have a drink, I'm not going to have a drink. If I've got a problem with alcohol, I'm going to have several drinks. And then I could get in the car and drive, and I could kill a bunch of people. Or I could, have diabetes or something like that, such condition that drinking alcohol is really, really dangerous for me to do. But it's not looked at that same way. Like if I said to a bunch of people, I think I'm just going to go out and get drunk, a lot of people would probably say, yeah, I'll go with you. If you told a lot of people I'm going to shoot some heroin just to feel a little bit, take the edge off a little bit, they would react like that. I'm not advocating illegal drug use over alcohol use. I'm not advocating anything. I am saying, though, that is an interesting perspective she has, because I was reading about something where people who use hard drugs, as they call it, have been able to moderate them. Now, don't go out and start shooting heroin because, Quackaholics Anonymous said you could do it. I mean, that's not what I mean. But it's an important salient point I think she brings up. I think I've used the word salient twice in this video now, so I'll retire it. And then let's see. In addition, the focus of the brain disease model on neurobiology and underlying pathology and not the psychological, social, and economic factors kind of constricts our ability to construct effective policies and interventions to address addiction. It also creates its own stigma, dividing people who believe they have the disease and people who don't. This could impede people from acknowledging that they're struggling with drugs, or if they acknowledge this, creates a sense of helplessness and pessimism. I'm going to skip a few more lines here because she's mainly talking about medications, prescription medications. There are certain prescription medications that I believe people should avoid under alcohol abuse, and abuse. I could tell you some horror stories about that. She's got a few more lines here about certain types of antidepressants and certain medications. You can read this article if you want to. I'll post a link in the video when I post this online. So I'll get to the final. Is there anything else you would like to add? If I could choose one point to make to stick in the mind of everyone who works one way or the other in the world of addiction, it's the need to appreciate the heterogeneity of why people with addiction use drugs and how best to help. There's no one-size-fits-all explanation or intervention. There's no universal truth here. And I can say that as a philosopher, she writes. That was kind of a nice way to round it off. I hate to break it to her, but there's too many people making a living in the 12-step cult religion that's certainly not going to want to hear that it's anything but a spiritual malady, that only a spiritual experience, as per Bill W., can cure. Not because they're even concerned about people's addiction problems, but because they're concerned about keeping those rehab centers and those drug courts and those halfway house scams in business. But anyway, I thought that was a pretty good article, and I'm glad it's out there in the public for all to see and read. Until next time.